Story 1: The Body That Wasn't Dead. It started like any other night at Holloway Funeral Home. Quiet, dimly lit, and reeking of antiseptic and old wood. James Calloway, the mortician, was used to solitude. He even liked it. The silence of the dead was preferable to the noise of the living. He could work in peace, surrounded by cold flesh and unspoken stories, preparing them for their final journey. That night, he was alone in the embalming room, a sterile, windowless space that had seen more death than most hospitals. The air was cool, humming with the faint buzz of fluorescent lights. James glanced at the clipboard. Name: Henry Wallace. Age: 47. Cause of death: cardiac arrest. Nothing unusual. Middle-aged men dropped dead from heart attacks all the time. He set the clipboard down, pulled on his gloves, and turned toward the body. Henry Wallace lay on the stainless steel table, covered from the waist down by a white sheet. His skin had the waxy pallor of death, lips tinged blue. The rigor had started to wear off, leaving his limbs pliable. James worked methodically as always. He turned to the embalming machine, filling it with formaldehyde and arterial fluid, the pungent scent flooding the room. The trocar, long, sharp, unforgiving, lay ready beside him. A quick incision in the carotid artery, insert the tube, let the chemicals do their job. He leaned over the body, positioning the head. That's when he heard it. A soft, wet wheeze. James froze. For a moment, he told himself it was his imagination. Sometimes bodies expelled air as they settled, a simple matter of gas escaping decomposing lungs. But then it happened again. A slow, rattling breath. James's stomach twisted. His pulse hammered in his ears. He took a step back, staring at the corpse's chest. It didn't rise, didn't move, but the sound had come from somewhere. Another wheeze, louder this time, and then Henry Wallace's eyes snapped open. James staggered backward, slamming against the counter. His breath hitched in his throat as those lifeless, milky eyes locked onto his. The pupils were pinpricks, the irises dull and gray. Not the gaze of a man waking from a deep sleep. This was something else. The corpse twitched. First a single finger, then the whole hand. A violent, jerking motion, as if some unseen force was pulling it upright. Henry's lips parted, and a noise spilled from his throat. Not a groan, not a scream. A whisper. James didn't move. His rational mind screamed that this was impossible, that corpses didn't just wake up. But the part of him that had been working with the dead for 2 decades, the part that had seen strange things in the quiet hours of the night, knew better. Henry's mouth moved again, forming words that barely escaped past cracked lips. Help me. James's legs were stone. He wanted to run, wanted to bolt through the doors and never return. But he was rooted to the floor, watching as the dead man sat up. The sheet slid away, revealing a torso riddled with autopsy stitches. His chest caved slightly with every breath, each one more labored than the last. But something was wrong. Henry's arms jerked unnaturally, his shoulders twisting in a way that human joints shouldn't move. James found his voice, though it felt like gravel in his throat. Henry! The dead man's head snapped toward him, his expression blank, his mouth hanging open. His lips curled slightly, as though remembering how to smile. Not Henry. James's stomach bottomed out. He reached behind him blindly, fingers fumbling for something, anything, to defend himself. His hand found the embalming shears. The thing that was not Henry swung its legs over the table, moving with stiff, unnatural movements. James saw it now, the way the body shifted, as if something was inside, pulling the flesh like a poorly worn suit. It shambled forward, bare feet slapping against the cold tile. James gripped the shears tighter. His mind screamed for logic, for reason, but his instincts told him only one thing: run. He lunged for the door, but Henry, or whatever was inside Henry, moved faster. It collapsed against him, dead weight pinning him against the counter. The smell of decay flooded his senses, thick and cloying. The thing's mouth was at his ear now, and James felt something cold and wet against his skin. It was breathing him in. "You'll do?" it whispered, the voice wrong, layered. like more than one throat was speaking. James reacted without thinking. He jammed the shears into Henry's side. The body recoiled, but there was no blood, no scream, just a dry, rustling sound, like dead leaves scraping pavement. The thing took a step back, tilting its head. Its eyes, those lifeless pits, held something new now. Amusement. James's heart jackhammered against his ribs. He knew in that moment that he was not dealing with something that could be killed. This thing was already dead, and it wanted him next. James grabbed the embalming fluid and hurled it at the creature. The bottle shattered against its chest, soaking the flesh with pungent chemicals. The reaction was instant. The thing shrieked, a high, grating sound that made James's teeth ache. The skin where the fluid touched blackened, curling away in strips. James didn't wait to see more. He bolted for the door, wrenching it open just as the lights flickered. The temperature in the room dropped instantly, his breath fogging in the air. Behind him, the creature was laughing, a dry, rasping chuckle that crawled under his skin. James ran. Through the hall, past the silent rows of caskets, through the front door that groaned on rusted hinges. He didn't stop until he was outside, gulping in the crisp night air. Inside the funeral home, the lights flickered again, and the laughter followed him into the dark. Story 2: The Last Ride. The call came in just after midnight. Joe Mallory sat in the cramped office of Bailey and Sons Funeral Home, nursing the dregs of a lukewarm coffee, when the old landline rang. He almost didn't answer. His shift was nearly over, and the only thing waiting for him at home was a TV dinner and a half-empty bottle of bourbon. But duty was duty. "This is Mallory," he said, rubbing the exhaustion from his eyes. A man's voice, thin and reedy, filtered through the receiver. "We need a transport. Immediate pickup. St. Mary's Hospital." Joe frowned. Late-night runs weren't uncommon, but there was something off about the caller. No name given, no small talk, just the order. "Bailey's usually handles these during the day. Who am I speaking to?" A pause. Then, "Dr. Whitaker. The body's ready for transport." A click. The line went dead. Joe exhaled through his nose. He didn't like it, but he wasn't paid to ask questions. He grabbed his coat, slipped his flask into the inside pocket, and headed for the garage. The hearse, a 1998 Cadillac, sat in the dim light, its black paint swallowing the overhead fluorescence. Joe ran a hand along its length. Good old girl. Reliable. The hospital was a 10-minute drive. St. Mary's loomed against the night sky, all harsh angles and flickering neon. Inside, the air was thick with antiseptic and something else, something stale. A nurse directed him to the morgue. Dr. Whitaker was waiting, or at least Joe assumed it was him. A gaunt man in a white coat, his sunken eyes framed by deep shadows. He gestured toward a gurney, a sheeted figure atop it. "John Doe," Whitaker said. "No family, no ID." Joe sighed and wheeled the gurney toward the hearse. The body was light, too light. He felt bones beneath the thin sheet, the hollowness of a man long starved. Once the body was secured in the back, Joe climbed into the driver's seat and checked his watch. 1:15. The roads would be empty. He put the hearse in gear and pulled away from the hospital, the rear compartment eerily silent behind him. 15 minutes into the drive, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The body had shifted. Joe's hands tightened on the wheel. The gurney was secured. There was no way it could have moved. Maybe he hit a bump. He turned his attention back to the road, but the back of his neck prickled. He risked another glance. The sheet had slipped. A hand, thin and gray, poked out. Joe swallowed, his throat dry. He flicked on the radio, static. He twisted the dial, but every station was the same. The body shifted again. The hearse swerved. Joe cursed, gripping the wheel, pulling over onto the shoulder. The engine idled, the low hum filling the silence. He sat there, breathing hard, staring into the rearview mirror. The body was still. He exhaled, his pulse pounding in his ears. He was overtired, that was all. Seeing things. He climbed out, the night air biting against his skin. Walking around to the back, he hesitated before opening the door. The hearse creaked as he peered inside. The sheet was completely off. The John Doe was still on the gurney, but his body was twisted, arms bent at unnatural angles, mouth gaping wide as if caught mid-scream. Joe's breath hitched. He reached out, hesitant, and touched the corpse's shoulder. It was ice cold. He let out a shaky laugh. Just his mind playing tricks. Maybe the straps weren't tight enough. He adjusted them, pulling the sheet back up, making sure everything was secure before slamming the door shut. Back in the driver's seat, he took a swig from his flask, letting the whiskey burn away his nerves. He put the car in drive and pulled back onto the road. 10 minutes later, he checked the mirror again. The body was sitting up. Joe's stomach lurched. His foot slammed the brake. The hearse skidded, tires screeching, the smell of burning rubber filling the air. He sat there, frozen, gripping the wheel. Slowly, he turned. The John Doe was still, only he wasn't alone. A second figure crouched beside the corpse, long and skeletal, its skin pulled tight over sharp bones. Hollow eyes gleamed from the darkness, and a jagged smile split its face. Joe's breath came in short gasps. He fumbled for the door handle, but the thing moved. One bony finger rose to its lips. A warning. Joe's shaking fingers turned the key. The engine sputtered. Died. The thing moved closer. Joe slammed his fist against the wheel. Come on! Come on! Come on! The hearse roared to life. He threw it into gear and peeled off down the road, his heart hammering. He didn't dare look back. The funeral home was up ahead. He yanked the wheel, tires screeching as he tore into the lot. The second he stopped, he jumped out, nearly tripping over himself as he threw open the back doors. The John Doe lay still. The second figure was gone. Joe stood there, panting. His hands trembled as he reached for the gurney, rolling it out and into the funeral home. The hall was silent, the overhead lights flickering. He shoved the gurney into the prep room and slammed the door. He wasn't going to embalm this one. That was someone else's problem. He turned, ready to leave. A whisper scraped against the back of his neck. Not done yet. Joe spun, heart slamming against his ribs. The John Doe was sitting up, his mouth twisted into a grin that wasn't his own. Behind him, a shadow peeled itself from the wall, unfolding impossibly long limbs. Joe didn't have time to scream. Story 3: The Hands in the Walls. Holloway Funeral Home had been in business for over a century. A grand old thing, 3 stories of weather-worn brick and arched windows. It stood like a forgotten relic in the middle of town, its once proud iron gate rusted and creaking. Families still brought their dead here, though fewer than before. The world had changed. People preferred streamlined services, digital condolences, quick cremations. But Holloway clung to the old ways. The basement was where the bodies were prepared. It smelled of formaldehyde, damp stone, and something else, the scent of time, perhaps, the way old things smell when they refuse to fade. And then, of course, there were the rumors. It started small, the way these things always do. Danny Mullins, a part-time worker with more ambition than sense, was the first to see it. He had been down in the basement late one evening, moving an empty gurney back to its corner when he noticed a ripple in the wallpaper. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the dim light, just the way shadows moved in this place. Then he saw the fingers. Pale, grayish-white fingers, pushing outward through the faded floral wallpaper. Not violently, not like in the movies, just pressing, testing the surface, as if someone on the other side was trying to feel their way through. Danny froze. His throat went dry. The fingers flexed, curled slightly. He could see the nail beds, the wrinkles of the knuckles. Then, just as quickly as they had come, they withdrew. The wallpaper settled back into place. Nothing but a faint, lingering bulge remaining. Danny stumbled backward, knocking over a tray of embalming tools. The sound was deafening in the hush of the basement. He didn't scream, he wanted to, but he didn't. Instead, he bolted up the stairs 2 at a time, shoving open the heavy door that led to the main level. He didn't stop running until he was outside, his breath fogging in the cold night air. "You saw what?" Mr. Holloway, the third-generation owner of the funeral home, stood behind the front desk, arms crossed over his chest. He was a man who did not tolerate nonsense. His father had been the same way, and his grandfather even worse. The Holloways ran their business with an iron grip, and they didn't have time for ghost stories. Danny wiped a shaking hand across his face. The wallpaper, downstairs. Hands. I swear to God, Mr. Holloway, there were hands in the walls. Mr. Holloway's expression didn't change. He let out a slow breath and then, without a word, turned and walked toward the basement door. Danny hesitated. Wait, you're going down there? I own this place, Mr. Holloway said simply. If there's a problem in my basement, I intend to see it for myself. Danny didn't want to go back down, but the thought of letting Holloway go alone seemed worse. He trailed behind reluctantly, heart hammering. The basement was just as he had left it. Quiet, still, the hum of the fluorescent light the only sound. The wallpaper, that god-awful old wallpaper, sat undisturbed against the concrete walls. Holloway walked up to the spot Danny had pointed out and placed his palm flat against it. He pressed. He knocked. He listened. Nothing. He turned to Danny, expression unreadable. This home has been here for over 100 years, he said, voice level. The foundation settles. The walls shift. It's an old building. Danny swallowed hard. I know what I saw. Mr. Holloway studied him for a moment longer before letting out a sigh. Get some rest. You've been working late. And with that, the conversation was over. But the hands weren't done. Over the next few days, other workers started to see things. Not always the hands, but something. The air in the basement felt heavier, charged. A smell, different from the usual chemical stink, started to seep through the cracks. It was a wet, earthy scent, like soil turned over in the rain. Late one evening, Mrs. Geller, the mortician's assistant, was locking up when she heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails on wood. She followed the sound to the basement door. Knock, 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 came from below. She turned the handle, opened the door an inch. The tapping stopped. A rush of cold, stale air crept up the stairs. Mrs. Geller shut the door and bolted it. Danny refused to go back downstairs alone. He convinced another worker, Miguel, to come with him. Safety in numbers, right? They descended together, flashlights in hand, the overhead fluorescence flickering as they went. The moment they reached the bottom step, both of them stopped cold. The wallpaper was shifting. The hands were back. Dozens of them this time, pushing outward, straining against the fabric-thin barrier between the living and the dead. Some hands were large, some small. Some withered, some disturbingly fresh. A moan, low, guttural, rose from the walls. Miguel dropped his flashlight. Jesus Christ! The wallpaper split. The seam burst open like wet paper, and something came through. A hand, fully formed, wrist and all, reaching, clawing at the air. The fingers flexed, then twisted in an unnatural way, bones cracking as they moved. A second hand emerged beside it. Then a third. Then too many to count. Danny grabbed Miguel's arm. Run! They turned and sprinted up the stairs, but the basement door slammed shut before they reached it. Miguel threw his shoulder against it. It wouldn't budge. Behind them, the hands kept coming. Danny grabbed a nearby stool and hurled it at the door. The impact rattled the wood, but it held. Then, silence. They turned. The hands were gone. The wallpaper hung in limp tatters, the concrete wall beneath it smooth and unbroken, as if nothing had happened at all. Holloway boarded up the basement the next morning. Said it was for renovations. No one questioned it. But some nights, when the town is quiet and the funeral home stands in eerie stillness, you can still hear it. The faintest sound of fingers scratching just beneath the surface. Waiting for someone to let them out. Story 4: The Smiling Man in the Morgue. The first time it happened, I told myself it was a mistake. Bodies twitch sometimes. Muscles fire off random signals. Nerves send one last dying pulse. That's what I told myself. The man's name was Richard Galley, 47 years old, found dead in his trailer from an apparent heart attack. when the paramedics brought him in. His skin was the dull, waxy gray of a man who had been dead too long without proper refrigeration. No signs of trauma, no foul play, just another sad, lonely death. I've worked at Branton County Morgue for 8 years now, and I've seen plenty. Car crashes, suicides, bloated floaters pulled from the lake. You build a tolerance. But there was something about Richard's face that stuck with me. Even in death, he had this look, like he was in on some big cosmic joke the rest of us weren't privy to. The first time he sat up, I nearly pissed myself. It was late past midnight. I'd been working alone since 9, processing the backlog of bodies. Flu season always brings a surge, and that year was no different. I had just finished making an incision along the femoral artery of an elderly woman when I heard the sound. A soft creak of metal against linoleum. I turned and there he was. Richard Galley sat upright on the steel gurney, his back ramrod straight, arms hanging at his sides. And that grin, that awful, knowing grin, stretched wide across his gray face. My heart jackhammered in my chest. For a full 5 seconds, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then my body remembered itself, and I staggered back, knocking a tray of scalpels onto the floor. "Jesus," I whispered. The rational part of my brain scrambled for an explanation. Cadaveric spasm, I thought. It happens. Sometimes. But not like this. Not fully sitting up like a goddamn corpse in a bad horror movie. I forced myself forward, ignoring the ice crawling up my spine. With trembling fingers, I reached out, pressing against Richard's chest. Stiff as a board. Rigor mortis. He wasn't moving again. I swallowed hard and laid him back down. I didn't tell anyone. What was I supposed to say? "Hey, the dead guy just sat up and smiled at me? That's how you get a psych eval." I made sure the gurney's wheels were locked, then got back to work. I told myself it was a fluke. And then it happened again. This time I saw it on the camera feed. I was in the office, finishing up paperwork, when movement on the monitor caught my eye. I have a live feed of the embalming room standard security procedure. And there, on the grainy black and white footage, I saw Richard Galley move. Not just a twitch, not just a slump. His head turned, slow and deliberate, toward the camera. His mouth stretched wider, revealing dark gums and teeth that looked too big in his shrunken face. I slammed the laptop shut. My stomach lurched. I could still feel his eyes on me, even through the screen. This wasn't normal. I went back into the embalming room. He was still lying there, stiff and silent, right where I'd left him. But I knew what I had seen. The next night, he was closer to the exit. I walked in at the start of my shift, and Richard Galley's gurney was no longer where it had been. It had moved, not by much, maybe 2 feet, but enough. Enough that my blood turned to ice. I checked the cameras again, fast-forwarded through the footage, and there it was. Between 3:12 and 3:15 a.m., the screen flickered, and Richard's gurney shifted, just a little. I rewound, watched again. The movement was subtle, but it was there. No one had been in the room. No one touched it. The gurney had moved on its own. That night, I locked the door to the embalming room. By the next morning, the door was unlocked, and Richard was sitting up again. I didn't go to work the night after that. I called in sick, something I never do. Spent the whole night sitting up in bed, clutching my phone, waiting for a call from the day shift. It came at 7:45 a.m. "Hey man," said Doug, the morning attendant. You forget to put one of the bodies in the cooler last night?" My skin turned cold. "What do you mean?" Doug hesitated. "Richard Galley. Found him in the hallway." I didn't answer. Couldn't. "Weird thing is," Doug went on, "he was like, right by the back door. Almost like he was leaving." A pause. "Hey, did you move his face? Like, make him smile or something?" I hung up. Then I packed a bag and left town. I never went back. I don't know what happened to Richard Galley's body after that. I don't want to know. But sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet, I swear I hear the faint sound of metal wheels rolling against linoleum. And I know he's still moving. Closer. Story 5: The Wrong Coffin. The funeral home smelled of carnations and old wood. The scent hung heavy in the air, mingling with the sterile, cloying odor of embalming fluid. Lisa Calloway clenched her husband's hand as they stepped into the dimly lit viewing room. Her father, Richard Calloway, had passed suddenly. An aneurysm, the doctors said. One moment he'd been sitting in his recliner watching the ball game, and the next he was gone. Just like that. Lisa had spent the last 3 days in a fog, the world feeling unreal, like she was watching everything through a pane of thick glass. But now, standing before the casket, she felt something sharper cut through the numbness. Confusion. The man in the coffin was not her father. "Oh my God!" she whispered, her breath catching in her throat. The body was dressed in her father's favorite navy suit, the one she'd personally dropped off at the funeral home 2 days ago. The hands, folded neatly over the chest, bore her father's wedding ring, dulled with time and grief. But the face, who the hell is this? Her voice cracked as she turned to the funeral director, Mr. Gibson, who stood stiffly by the door, pale as a ghost himself. I don't understand," he stammered, his fingers fumbling with the cuffs of his jacket. This should be Richard Calloway." "Well, it isn't," Lisa snapped, her grip tightening on her husband's hand. "Where is my father?" Her mother, Evelyn, let out a strangled sob, clutching her chest. "They lost him," she whispered, horrified. "Oh dear Lord, they lost him." Lisa shook her head, anger rising fast. No, this wasn't some lost luggage at the airport. This was her father. Mr. Gibson ran a hand down his face. "There must be a mistake. Let me check the records." They followed him to the back office, where he rifled through files, muttering under his breath. The fluorescent light overhead flickered as if the very air was thick with something wrong. Finally, he found what he was looking for and froze. Lisa leaned over the desk. The paperwork listed her father's name, but beside it, another, far more horrifying note. Body received. Interred yesterday, Forest Hills Cemetery. Lisa's stomach bottomed out. "What?" Mr. Gibson stared, his lips moving wordlessly. Evelyn let out a low, wounded moan. "Buried. Yesterday." Her father had been buried in someone else's place. Lisa grabbed her husband's arm. "We have to go. Now." The cemetery was quiet in the cold evening air, the sun dipping below the horizon, staining the sky the color of fresh bruises. Lisa and her family barely waited for the groundskeeper to unlock the gates before rushing toward the plot listed in the records. It was a fresh grave, a rectangle of disturbed earth, still slightly mounded from where the dirt had been shoveled back in. The headstone hadn't even been placed yet, just a small temporary marker with her father's name misspelled on it. Lisa dropped to her knees. "We have to get him out. What if?" Her voice faltered. A faint sound rose from the ground beneath her palms. A scratching. Lisa's breath hitched in her throat. The sound was soft, barely there, but growing more frantic by the second. "Oh my God!" her husband whispered. "He's alive." Panic shot through them all like lightning. The groundskeeper, already shaken, fumbled for his phone, but Lisa didn't wait. She grabbed the nearest shovel from a tool cart and began to dig. Her hands shook, her heartbeat hammering in her ears. The others joined her. They dug like people possessed, flinging dirt in all directions. The scratching continued, faster, more desperate. A muffled thump, a sound like fingernails tearing. Then a groan. Lisa screamed. They reached the coffin lid. It was a cheap pine box, the kind used for budget burials, and it was covered in scratches, deep gouges from the inside. They worked at the nails, prying it open with trembling hands until finally, the lid gave way. Lisa recoiled at the sight. Her father lay inside, his face twisted in agony, his eyes wide open. His fingernails were bloodied stumps, raw from clawing. His lips were torn where he had bitten them, his final gasping breaths trapped inside the coffin. Too late by minutes, maybe seconds. Evelyn collapsed with a wail. Lisa felt her own throat lock up, as if her father's last breath had reached up from that grave and stolen hers. The funeral director was stammering something, but Lisa didn't hear. All she could see was her father's open, staring eyes, frozen in horror. And then, a breath. Her father's chest rose. Shallow, fragile. Lisa choked on a sob. "Dad!" His lips parted, and a sound came out. Not a word, not a gasp, but something else. A whisper. A single, rasping, gurgling whisper that sent ice plunging into Lisa's bones. "Not me." Lisa blinked, unsure she'd heard right. But then her father turned his head, the movement unnatural, jerky. His bloodshot eyes locked onto hers. And then, in a voice that did not belong to Richard Calloway, he spoke again. "Not me." The wind picked up. The trees rustled. The cemetery seemed to darken all at once. Lisa staggered back, because whatever had been buried in that coffin, whatever had been scratching, fighting its way out, it wasn't her father anymore. Story 6: The Gravedigger's Regret. Jeb Carter had been digging graves for 30 years, long enough to know the dead don't always stay where they're put. He worked the night shift at Hollow Pines Cemetery, a sprawling burial ground on the edge of town, where the fog rolled in thick after sundown and the wind whispered through the skeletal trees. It was quiet work, mostly. Just him, his shovel, and the occasional drunk teenager daring each other to jump the fence. But on that cold October evening, as Jeb made his usual rounds, something didn't sit right. He stopped at Section 8, a newer part of the cemetery, where the graves were fresh and the earth still loose. His flashlight beam skimmed over the rows of headstones until it landed on something that sent a slow, crawling chill up his spine. A grave, a fresh one. The dirt was piled high, like someone had just finished the job. But that wasn't possible. He hadn't dug a grave here today, and there weren't any new burials scheduled. Jeb swallowed hard. Maybe one of the other workers had made a mistake, dug the wrong plot. It wouldn't be the first time. He checked his clipboard, flipping through the handwritten logs. Nothing. No burials for today. No burials for this entire row. And yet, there it was. A mound of fresh-turned earth. Jeb felt the familiar itch of unease deep in his gut. But he was an old man, and old men didn't spook easy. He grabbed his shovel and stepped forward. Something wasn't right. The soil was too loose, too unsettled, like something had moved inside. He set the shovel into the dirt and dug. The deeper he went, the more that uneasy feeling spread, curling around his ribs like cold fingers. And then, with one hard shove, the metal tip of his shovel struck something solid. Coffin. Jeb wiped his brow, his breath coming short. It was a simple wooden casket, the kind used for low-budget funerals, nothing fancy, just pine and nails. But the nails were pushed outward. He stared. His mouth went dry. Something had gotten out. Jeb's hands trembled as he pried the lid open. Inside, there was nothing but deep scratch marks along the wood, like someone or something had clawed its way free. The air in the coffin was damp, thick with the scent of fresh earth and something sour, something wrong. Then he heard it, a shuffle, a slow, dragging sound coming from behind him. Jeb turned too fast, his old knee nearly giving out. His flashlight beam sliced through the darkness, searching. Nothing, just rows of tombstones stretching into the mist. The silence pressed in, thick as grave dirt, and then a footprint, in the soft earth beside the grave, barefoot, too deep for a ghost, too real for a trick of the light. Jeb's breath hitched. He wasn't alone. He swung the flashlight wildly, scanning the cemetery. That's when he saw them, more footprints, leading away from the grave, heading toward the trees, heading toward town. His heart slammed against his ribs. Someone had been buried here, and now they weren't. Jeb dropped his shovel and ran. For the first time in 30 years, he left a grave unfinished. And for the first time in 30 years, he knew he'd never be able to sleep again. Story 7: Do not open this casket. The funeral home smelled of carnations and stale coffee, the way all funeral homes do. Soft organ music droned through hidden speakers, and mourners shuffled in the dim light, speaking in hushed voices, as if the dead could still hear. The deceased was Walter Crowley, an old man who had lived alone in that sagging house at the edge of town. The details of his death were vague, something about an unfortunate accident, though no one elaborated. The closed casket sat at the front of the room, black and polished to a dull shine. A framed photo of Walter in his younger years rested on a stand beside it. He had a sharp face, deep-set eyes, and a wiry frame. He'd never been a friendly man, but he was a fixture in town, the kind of person people whispered about but never confronted. And then there was the sign. A small, yellowed card sat atop the casket, tucked into the flower arrangement. The message was simple, typed in bold capital letters. "Do not open this casket." It was an odd thing to see at a funeral. It made people uneasy. Murmurs passed between the mourners like a slow-moving disease. Why wouldn't they want it opened? Was he in some kind of accident? Maybe the embalming didn't go right. I heard he wasn't embalmed at all. Speculation was a dangerous thing. Turned grief into curiosity, curiosity into temptation. That was how Michael Ellis got the idea. Michael had never particularly liked Walter. The old man had given him the creeps ever since he was a kid. Always watching from his front porch, his yellowed fingers wrapped around a cigarette, eyes dark and sunken. Michael had even had a nightmare once about Walter grinning at him from the shadows of his bedroom. So, yeah, he didn't much care that Walter was dead. But he did care about the casket. The card was practically daring someone to open it. The way people kept glancing at it, then quickly looking away, was enough to make his pulse quicken. It was human nature. If you tell someone not to do something, they'll want to do it even more. And Michael was always the type to press the big red button. The lid opens. He waited until the room thinned out, until only a few mourners remained, speaking in low voices near the back. The funeral director had stepped out, probably for a smoke. Michael glanced around, then moved closer. His hands felt sweaty as he reached for the lid. His heart beat in his throat. Just a peek. Just enough to see why the warning was there. His fingers slid under the edge of the casket lid, and he lifted, just an inch. First, he saw nothing. Just darkness, the deep shadow within the casket. Then something moved. Not fast. Not a jerk of motion. Just a slow, deliberate shift, like something in there was rearranging itself. Michael's breath caught. He told himself it was nerves, his imagination playing tricks. But then the smell hit him. Not the smell of death. Not rot. Something worse. It was old. Ancient. Thick like oil, clinging to the back of his throat. Then he saw the fingers. At first, he thought they were Walter's hands folded neatly over his chest, as corpses often were. But no, they were wrong. The skin was too smooth, too stretched, as if someone had pulled a waxy film over bones. And the nails, long, black, curving into points, slowly twitched against the fabric of the casket's interior. Michael's stomach lurched. Then the eyes opened. Two slits of pure, oily black, reflecting nothing, absorbing everything. Something whispered, not out loud, inside his skull. Michael slammed the lid shut, his breath ragged, his hands shaking. He took a stumbling step backward, nearly knocking over a flower arrangement. No one had noticed. No one had seen. The funeral director returned a moment later, giving Michael a strange look. "You okay?" Michael could only nod. He backed away from the casket, turned, and left the funeral home as fast as he could without drawing attention. The consequence. That night, Michael couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those black, empty eyes staring back at him. Something had been in that casket. Something that wasn't Walter Crowley. And then, just past midnight, his phone rang. Not a text. Not a notification. An old-fashioned, shrill ringing. Michael's chest tightened as he reached for his phone. The screen was blank. No caller ID. He hesitated, then answered. For a second, there was nothing. Just static. Then, so softly it could have been the wind. "You shouldn't have looked." Michael threw the phone across the room. It didn't matter. The whisper wasn't coming from the phone anymore. It was inside his head. And it wasn't alone. Epilogue. 3 days later, Michael Ellis was found dead in his apartment. There were no signs of forced entry, no signs of a struggle. The only strange thing? His body was still perfectly intact, except for his eyes. Those were missing. The police never found them.